The snowflakes fell like ash on the frozen corpses scattered before Quebec's walls, their crimson stains marking the end of America's boldest northern gambit. It was December 31st, 1775, and General Richard Montgomery lay dead in the snow, his dream of capturing British Canada dying with him in the pre-dawn darkness. 6 months earlier, the audacious plan had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The Second Continental Congress, flushed with early victories and revolutionary fervor, had authorized a two-pronged invasion of Quebec province. The reasoning was sound. If the Patriots could capture Quebec City and Montreal, they would deny the British a northern base of operations and potentially bring the French-speaking Canadians into their rebellion against King George III. Benedict Arnold, still months away from his infamous betrayal, had volunteered to lead one column through the Maine wilderness, a journey so treacherous it would later be called one of the most remarkable military marches in American history. Meanwhile, Montgomery would advance north through the traditional Lake Champlain corridor, capturing British strongholds along the way. The political calculation seemed favorable. Intelligence suggested that many French Canadians harbored resentment toward their British conquerors, who had only recently acquired the territory following the 7 Years' War. The Quebec Act of 1774, which had extended Quebec's boundaries and protected Catholic religious practices, had infuriated the 13 colonies, but was viewed with suspicion by many patriots as evidence that the French might be willing allies. Montgomery's initial advance proceeded with startling success. Fort St-Jean fell after a determined siege, and Montreal surrendered without a fight in November. The British garrison, under Governor Guy Carleton, had been caught off guard by the speed and determination of the American advance. Carleton himself barely escaped capture, fleeing down the St. Lawrence River disguised as a common sailor to reach Quebec City. Meanwhile, Arnold's expedition through the Maine wilderness had become an epic of endurance and suffering. His men had carried their boats and supplies through trackless forests, across rushing rivers, and over mountain passes already locked in winter's grip. Of the original 1,100 men who had departed Cambridge in September, fewer than 700 would reach the plains of Abraham outside Quebec. According to military historian Robert McConnell Hatch's detailed account in Thrust for Canada, the convergence of these two forces before Quebec City in early December represented one of the war's most ambitious strategic moves. The Patriots had managed to coordinate separate armies across hundreds of miles of wilderness, bringing nearly 2,000 men to the gates of Britain's most important North American fortress. But Quebec City was no Montreal, perched on towering cliffs above the St. Lawrence River, surrounded by formidable stone walls, and now commanded by the capable Carleton. It represented a far different challenge. The city's natural defenses had been strengthened over decades of French and British rule, creating what many considered the most impregnable fortress in North America. As December's bitter cold settled over the plains of Abraham, Montgomery and Arnold faced a cruel dilemma. Their men were already suffering from exposure, disease, and dwindling supplies. A traditional siege was impossible in the Canadian winter, yet storming the walls seemed suicidal. The enlistments of many soldiers would expire with the new year, meaning any assault would have to come soon or not at all. The stage was set for a desperate gamble that would determine not just the fate of Quebec, but the entire northern theater of the American Revolution. The bitter December wind howled across the plains of Abraham as the unlikely allies prepared for what both knew might be their last campaign together. Richard Montgomery, the Irish-born former British officer who had resigned his commission to join the Patriot cause, stood in stark contrast to Benedict Arnold, the ambitious Connecticut merchant whose personal courage was matched only by his driving ambition for glory and profit. Montgomery cut an impressive figure despite the hardships of the campaign. Tall and dignified, with the bearing of a professional soldier, he had won the respect of his men through competent leadership. During the advance from Fort Ticonderoga, his marriage to Jana Livingston had connected him to one of New York's most prominent families, giving him political as well as military credibility. Yet the 38-year-old general carried the weight of enormous expectations. As he gazed up at Quebec's imposing walls, Arnold presented a more complex picture. Short and stocky, with piercing dark eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire, he possessed an almost reckless personal bravery that inspired fierce loyalty among his followers. His march through the Maine wilderness had already become legendary, but it had cost him dearly. Disease and desertion had reduced his force to fewer than 700 effective men. many of whom were on the verge of collapse from malnutrition and exposure inside Quebec's walls. Governor-General Guy Carleton was orchestrating his own preparations with the cool efficiency that had made him one of Britain's most respected colonial administrators, a veteran of the 7 Years' War who had served under General James Wolfe. During the original conquest of Quebec, Carleton understood both the strategic importance of his position and the desperate nature of his situation. The governor's greatest challenge lay not in the city's physical defenses, which were formidable, but in the loyalty of its inhabitants. Quebec City's population of roughly 8,000 included a complex mix of French-Canadian civilians, British merchants, government officials, and military personnel. The Quebec Act had attempted to secure French-Canadian loyalty through religious tolerance and territorial expansion, but many inhabitants remained neutral at best in what they viewed as an English civil war. Carleton's military resources were similarly mixed. His regular British forces numbered fewer than 200 men, supplemented by roughly 300 Canadian militia of questionable reliability, and about 400 British sailors from ships trapped in the harbor by ice. The governor had also recruited several dozen loyal volunteers from among the city's British merchant community, men who understood that American success would likely mean the destruction of their livelihoods. Historical records from the archives of Canada, as documented in military correspondence, reveal that Carleton spent considerable effort during December attempting to rally French-Canadian support. He issued proclamations calling on all loyal subjects to defend their city, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that significant portions of the population might welcome the American invaders. The Americans, meanwhile, struggled with their own morale and supply problems. The harsh Canadian winter was unlike anything most of the New England and New York troops had experienced. Frostbite and illness were epidemic, while adequate food, warm clothing, and ammunition remained in critically short supply. Many soldiers lacked proper winter boots, wrapping their feet in rags and strips of canvas torn from their tents. Arnold's men suffered particularly severe hardships. Their epic march had left them without adequate supplies and the promised provisions from Montgomery's force proved insufficient for the combined armies. Many of Arnold's soldiers had not been paid in months, and their enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. The question of whether they would agree to extend their service hung over the entire expedition like a sword. Montgomery faced an equally pressing timeline. His own troops' enlistments would also expire at year's end, and he knew that maintaining discipline and morale through a long winter siege would be nearly impossible. The general had already sent urgent appeals to Congress for reinforcements, supplies, and authority to raise new troops, but he understood that help was unlikely to arrive before spring dawned by mid-December. Both American commanders had reached the same grim conclusion. Quebec would have to be taken by storm or not at all. Christmas Day, 1775, brought no peace to the American camp outside Quebec. Montgomery huddled with Arnold and their senior officers in a cramped farmhouse. Maps spread across a rough wooden table as candles flickered in the winter drafts. The intelligence they had gathered painted a daunting picture of Quebec's defenses, but also revealed potential weaknesses that desperate men might exploit. The city's geography dictated any assault strategy. Quebec sat on a high bluff overlooking the St. Lawrence River, with the upper town protected by strong stone walls, and the lower town clustered along the narrow shore below. The fortress's greatest strength lay in its commanding position and artillery placement, which could devastate any force attempting a direct assault on the main gates or walls. Yet Quebec also possessed vulnerabilities that might be exploited under cover of darkness and winter storms. The lower town, while protected by walls and palisades, presented a potentially weaker target than the fortress above. If American forces could penetrate the lower town from multiple directions simultaneously, they might be able to establish a foothold and force the defenders to divide their attention. Arnold's proposal was characteristically bold and risky. His forces would attack the lower town from the north, advancing along the narrow path between the cliffs and the river. Meanwhile, Montgomery would lead his troops against the southern approaches to the lower town, creating the multiple points of attack necessary to prevent the British from concentrating their defense. The plan required extraordinary coordination and timing. Both columns would have to advance through several miles of difficult terrain in complete darkness, overcome defensive positions manned by alert sentries, and then converge on the lower town's central square before dawn. Success depended on surprise, speed, and the kind of luck that had thus far eluded the Americans throughout their campaign. Montgomery's reservations about the assault were evident in his private correspondence, portions of which survived in the Clements Library collections. Writing to his wife Jeanne, he expressed doubts about both the feasibility of the attack and the reliability of troops, whose enlistments were set to expire within days. Yet he also recognized that retreat would mean the complete failure of the Canadian expedition and potentially devastating consequences for the entire Patriot cause. The general's concerns extended beyond purely military considerations. Intelligence reports suggested that British reinforcements might arrive with the spring thaw, making any future assault exponentially more difficult. Moreover, the political situation in the other colonies remained fluid, with many still hoping for reconciliation with Britain. A spectacular success in Quebec might tip the balance toward independence, while a crushing defeat could strengthen loyalist sentiment throughout America. Arnold faced his own complex calculations. His personal ambition was legendary even among his fellow officers, and he viewed the Quebec assault as his opportunity to win the kind of military glory that would secure his place in history. Yet he also understood the terrible risks involved. His men were in poor condition after their ordeal in the Maine wilderness, and many were openly questioning the wisdom of the entire Canadian venture. The British, meanwhile, had not been idle. Carleton's spies and loyalist sympathizers had provided him with detailed intelligence about American troop strength, morale problems, and the approaching deadline of expiring enlistments. The governor had used this information to strengthen Quebec's defenses, where he anticipated the most likely attacks, while also preparing contingency plans for fighting within the city if the Americans managed to breach the outer defenses. On December 28th, Montgomery made his final decision. The assault would proceed on the night of December 31st, taking advantage of what weather reports suggested would be a severe snowstorm. The timing was both militarily sound and symbolically appropriate. The Americans would either capture Quebec in 1775 with a stunning victory, or they would fail and face the new year in defeat. The die was cast. As the final days of December ticked away, both armies prepared for a battle that would determine the fate of British North America and potentially alter the entire course of the American Revolution. December 31st, 1775, dawned gray and bitter, with the promise of heavy snow evident in the lowering clouds that pressed down upon Quebec. Like a funeral shroud, by afternoon, the storm had begun in earnest, driving snow horizontally across the plains of Abraham and reducing visibility to mere yards. For Montgomery and Arnold, huddled in their separate command posts, the weather seemed to offer both opportunity and ominous warning. The American assault plan, refined through days of careful preparation, called for separate attacks designed to divide British attention and create maximum confusion. Two of these would be diversionary feints against the walls of the upper town, intended to draw defenders away from the main objectives. The real assaults would target the lower town from opposite directions, with Montgomery's New York troops attacking from the south while Arnold's New Englanders advanced from the north. At 2 o'clock in the morning of January 1st, 1776, the signal rockets burst through the swirling snow, their red glare briefly illuminating the dark forms of American soldiers moving toward their destiny. Montgomery, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the storm, led his column of approximately 300 men along the treacherous path that skirted the base of the cliffs. Behind him marched men from New York and New Jersey, many of whom had followed him faithfully from the capture of Fort St. Jean through the long, cold weeks outside Quebec. The general's route took his force along the St. Lawrence River's edge, where ice formations and scattered boulders provided both cover and obstacles. The path was so narrow in places that the men had to advance in single file, their progress marked by the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional clatter of equipment against stone. Montgomery had ordered complete silence, but the howling wind provided adequate cover for the small sounds that inevitably accompanied troop movement. Arnold's column faced different but equally formidable challenges. Advancing from the north with roughly 600 men, including many of the survivors of his epic march through Maine, Arnold had to navigate through the suburb of St. Roch before reaching the lower town's defenses. His route was longer and more complex, requiring his troops to move through narrow streets and around buildings while maintaining formation in the blinding snowstorm. The diversionary attacks began precisely on schedule, with Patriot forces firing on the upper town walls and creating enough noise and confusion to suggest a major assault. British defenders responded as anticipated, manning the walls and returning fire while Carleton rushed to assess the situation. From his headquarters in the shadow of St. Louis, for nearly an hour, the deception worked perfectly. The British concentrated their attention on the upper town, leaving the lower town defenses with reduced garrisons. Montgomery's column had advanced to within striking distance of their first objective, a blockhouse and palisade known as Pres de Ville. When fate intervened with devastating swiftness, the blockhouse was defended by a small detachment of Canadian militia and British sailors, commanded by Captain Chabot, a local merchant who had volunteered for military service. As Montgomery's men emerged from the storm like ghostly apparitions, Chabot made the split-second decision that would alter American history. Instead of waiting for the Patriots to close distance, he ordered his men to fire the loaded cannon directly into the advancing column. The blast of grape shot and musket balls swept through Montgomery's leading ranks. With horrific effect, the general himself, leading from the front as was his custom, took multiple wounds and fell dead in the snow. His aide-de-camp, Captain John McPherson, died beside him, along with several other officers. The carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos as leaderless men either fled back into the storm or pressed forward in confused small groups. Meanwhile, Arnold's attack had initially proceeded more successfully. His men had penetrated the lower town's outer defenses and were fighting their way through the narrow streets toward their objective. But Arnold himself had been wounded early in the assault, struck in the leg by a musket ball that left him unable to continue leading his troops. Command passed to Captain Daniel Morgan, the legendary Virginia frontiersman whose men had formed the backbone of Arnold's expedition. According to detailed accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society as referenced in scholarly studies of the battle, Morgan's leadership kept the northern assault alive for several crucial hours. His men occupied buildings, engaged in fierce street fighting, and came tantalizingly close to achieving their objectives before superior British numbers. And the collapse of Montgomery's southern attack sealed their fate. As dawn broke on January 1st, 1776, the American dream of conquering Quebec lay shattered in the bloody snow of the lower town. The Patriots had gambled everything on a single night's work and lost catastrophically, with consequences that would reshape the entire northern theater of the Revolutionary War. The pale light of New Year's Day, 1776, revealed the full extent of American catastrophe. In the narrow streets of Quebec's lower town, Captain Daniel Morgan, the grizzled Virginia frontiersman who had assumed command after Arnold's wounding, found himself trapped with the survivors of the northern assault in a maze of stone buildings and frozen corpses. The sound of British drums echoed off the walls. As Governor Carleton's forces moved to complete their victory, Morgan's situation was desperate, but not yet hopeless. His men had penetrated deeper into the lower town than any previous assault, occupying several key buildings and establishing defensive positions that the British would have to assault at considerable cost. Yet the collapse of Montgomery's southern attack had eliminated any possibility of the coordinated assault that might have carried the day. Instead of supporting each other in a unified offensive, the surviving Americans found themselves isolated and surrounded. The British response demonstrated the professional competence that had made Carleton one of the empire's most respected governors. Rather than launching costly frontal assaults against Morgan's positions, Carleton systematically sealed off escape routes while bringing up artillery to pound the American strongholds. British regulars, Canadian militia, and armed sailors worked together with an efficiency that spoke well of their commanders' leadership and the months of preparation that had preceded this confrontation. Carleton's strategy reflected both military pragmatism and political calculation. A massacre of trapped Americans might serve British interests in the short term, but the governor was already thinking beyond the immediate battle. He hoped to end the siege of Quebec without creating martyrs who might inspire future American attacks, while also demonstrating British strength to the French-Canadian population, whose loyalty remained uncertain. For Morgan and his men, the morning brought a series of increasingly grim realizations. American casualties were mounting steadily as British marksmen picked off isolated soldiers, while ammunition supplies dwindled with each exchange of fire. More critically, the failure of Montgomery's assault meant that no relief was coming. The survivors faced the choice between fighting to the death in positions that could not be held or surrendering to an enemy whose treatment of prisoners remained uncertain. The decision became inevitable when British artillery began systematically destroying the buildings. Where Americans had taken shelter, solid shot crashed through stone walls, sending deadly fragments ricocheting through rooms packed with wounded and exhausted soldiers. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage, as men who had endured months of hardship finally reached the breaking point. Morgan's surrender came at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, after nearly 7 hours of fighting that had cost both sides heavily. The Virginian, tears streaming down his weathered face, handed over his sword to a British officer, while his surviving men laid down their arms in the blood-stained snow. With that gesture, American hopes of conquering Quebec died as surely as Montgomery had died in the pre-dawn darkness. The human cost of the failed assault was staggering for an army that could ill afford such losses. Montgomery's death had deprived the Patriots of one of their most capable generals, while Arnold's wounding removed another key leader from active service for crucial months. Beyond the leadership losses, American casualties included approximately 60 killed and wounded, with another 400 taken prisoner, nearly one-third of the entire force that had advanced against the city. British and Canadian losses were significantly lighter, with fewer than 20 killed and wounded, a disparity that reflected both the defensive advantages of fighting from prepared positions and the devastating effectiveness of the grape shot that had destroyed Montgomery's column. For Carleton, the victory provided not only immediate relief, but also validation of his defensive strategy and the loyalty of the French-Canadian militia who had fought alongside British regulars. The political implications of the defeat extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. News of Montgomery's death and the failure of the Quebec assault would reach the Continental Congress just as delegates were grappling with the momentous decision of whether to declare formal independence from Britain. The disaster in Canada served as a sobering reminder of British military capabilities and the enormous challenges facing the Patriot cause. Yet perhaps the most significant consequence of the Battle of Quebec was its impact on Arnold himself. Wounded and defeated, forced to watch helplessly as his men were marched away to captivity, the ambitious Connecticut merchant began the psychological transformation that would eventually lead him to betray the very cause for which he had sacrificed so much. The seeds of treason, some historians argue, were planted in the frozen streets of Quebec's lower town on that bitter New Year's morning. The aftermath of the Quebec assault unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe for the remnants of the American invasion force. Arnold, confined to his bed with a shattered leg, struggled to maintain some semblance of command over the demoralized survivors who remained outside the city walls. The Connecticut merchant's physical pain was matched by the agony of watching his reputation for invincibility crumble. Along with American hopes for conquering Canada inside Quebec, the 400 American prisoners found themselves in a precarious situation that reflected the complex politics of the Northern Campaign. Governor Carleton faced a delicate balancing act between demonstrating British strength and avoiding actions that might transform defeated enemies into martyrs for the Patriot cause. His treatment of the prisoners would be watched closely by French-Canadian observers whose ultimate loyalty remained uncertain. Daniel Morgan and his fellow prisoners were housed in cramped quarters within the city, their fate uncertain as Carleton considered his options. British law regarding rebels was clear enough: they could be executed as traitors. But the political reality of conducting such executions in a predominantly French-speaking city with ambivalent loyalties suggested a more moderate approach. The governor ultimately chose to treat the Americans as prisoners of war rather than criminals, a decision that reflected both pragmatic politics and personal honor. The human stories emerging from captivity revealed the full complexity of the Canadian campaign. Many of Arnold's men had followed their commander through the Maine wilderness, based on personal loyalty and shared hardships that had forged bonds stronger than military discipline. Now, separated from their leader and facing an uncertain future, these soldiers confronted questions about the cause for which they had sacrificed so much. Among the prisoners was Private Abner Stockin of Massachusetts, whose diary entries survived to provide intimate glimpses of captivity in Quebec. Stockin wrote of the strange kindness shown by French-Canadian civilians who smuggled food and warm clothing to the American prisoners despite the official prohibition against such contact. These gestures suggested that while French Canadians had not rallied to the Patriot banner, neither were they committed enemies of the American cause. The broader strategic situation deteriorating rapidly for the Americans remaining outside Quebec. Word of Montgomery's death and the assault's failure had spread throughout the northern colonies, making recruitment of replacements extremely difficult. Potential volunteers who might have been attracted by the prospect of sharing in a glorious victory showed little enthusiasm for joining what increasingly appeared to be a doomed enterprise. Congressional response to the Quebec disaster reflected the political tensions that would plague American strategy throughout the war. Many delegates viewed the Canadian campaign as an expensive distraction from more vital theaters, while others argued that abandoning the Northern Front would free British forces for operations against more vulnerable American positions. The debate consumed valuable time and resources, while Arnold's force continued to weaken outside Quebec's walls. The winter siege that followed the failed assault became an exercise in mutual exhaustion. Arnold, hobbling on crutches and driven by a determination that bordered on obsession, somehow maintained American positions despite disease, desertion, and chronic shortages of every necessity. His men built fortifications in the frozen ground, endured temperatures that killed sentries at their posts, and watched their numbers dwindle as enlistments expired and reinforcements failed to arrive. Carleton, meanwhile, faced his own challenges in maintaining morale and supplies through the long Canadian winter. The governor's correspondence, preserved in British archives, reveals growing concern about the reliability of French-Canadian militia and the economic impact of the prolonged siege on Quebec's civilian population. While militarily secure, the city was slowly being strangled by the American blockade that prevented normal commerce and supply operations. The broader war was evolving rapidly during these months of stalemate outside Quebec. In Massachusetts, George Washington was transforming the Continental Army into a more professional force, while political leaders in Philadelphia moved steadily toward the declaration of independence that would fundamentally alter the conflict's nature. The Northern Campaign, once viewed as potentially decisive, had become a sideshow that absorbed resources and attention without producing strategic benefits. By spring 1776, it had become clear that the American invasion of Canada had failed not just tactically, but strategically. The Patriots had sacrificed experienced officers, veteran soldiers, and enormous quantities of scarce supplies in pursuit of objectives that proved beyond their reach. More importantly, they had demonstrated to both enemies and allies the limitations of American military capabilities, providing encouragement to British forces throughout North America, while raising doubts among potential European allies about Patriot prospects for ultimate success. The dream of a 14th colony had died in the snow outside Quebec's walls, taking with it American illusions about the ease of conquering British North America. The spring thaw of 1776 brought more than seasonal change to the survivors of the Quebec campaign. It delivered the final, crushing blow to American hopes in the north. British reinforcements arrived with the first ships to navigate the ice-free St. Lawrence River, transforming Carleton's defensive posture into overwhelming offensive capability. Arnold, still recovering from his wounds, but possessed of enough military sense to recognize the impossible situation, finally ordered the long-delayed American retreat. The withdrawal from Quebec became the campaign's final humiliation. Disease-ridden, demoralized, and outnumbered by better than 3-1, the American forces fled southward in such disorder that they resembled refugees more than soldiers. Arnold himself, carried on a litter due to his unhealed leg wound, watched his dream of northern conquest dissolve like snow in spring rain. The Connecticut merchant, who had led over 1,000 men through the Maine wilderness, now commanded fewer than 300 effective soldiers. The strategic consequences of the Quebec failure rippled throughout the Revolutionary War, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. British forces, freed from the threat of American invasion, could now consider offensive operations southward into New York and New England. The Iroquois nations, who had remained largely neutral while American success seemed possible, began tilting toward the British side as news of Patriot defeats spread through their territories. More immediately damaging was the impact on American morale and recruitment. The deaths of Montgomery and other respected officers created gaps in military leadership that proved difficult to fill, while the capture of 400 experienced soldiers removed veteran troops from an army that desperately needed their skills elsewhere. The financial cost of the expedition, estimated at over $100,000 in continental currency, represented resources that could have equipped and supplied multiple regiments for service in more promising theaters. Yet perhaps the most significant long-term consequence involved Benedict Arnold himself. the ambitious officer who had volunteered for the main expedition, in hopes of winning military glory, found instead professional frustration and personal bitterness that would fester for years. His later correspondence reveals a man increasingly convinced that his sacrifices had been inadequately recognized and his capabilities undervalued by both military superiors and political leaders. The failed Quebec assault marked the beginning of Arnold's psychological journey from patriot hero to British traitor. Military historians have debated whether his eventual betrayal stemmed from personal grievances, financial pressures, or ideological disillusionment. A few dispute that the Quebec campaign played a crucial role in shaping his later actions. The man who had led one of the war's most remarkable marches would ultimately become synonymous with treachery and betrayal for the British Empire. The successful defense of Quebec represented more than a tactical victory. It preserved the foundation for what would eventually become modern Canada. Carleton's competent leadership and the loyalty demonstrated by French-Canadian defenders helped establish patterns of cooperation between English and French speakers that would define Canadian political development for generations. The battle's broader significance in Revolutionary War history extends beyond its immediate military consequences. Quebec represented the high watermark of American territorial ambitions during the conflict, the furthest point of Patriot expansion before the long process of consolidation and survival that would ultimately lead to independence. The failure demonstrated that the revolution would be won not through dramatic conquests, but through the patient accumulation of smaller victories and the gradual erosion of British will to continue the conflict. Contemporary accounts, including those preserved in the journals of the Continental Congress, reveal how deeply the Quebec disaster affected American political leadership. The defeat forced delegates to confront uncomfortable realities about their military capabilities and strategic limitations, contributing to debates about foreign alliances, military organization, and the wisdom of declaring formal independence. While British forces remained so formidable, the human cost of the Quebec campaign extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Families throughout New England and New York received news of sons, fathers, and brothers who had marched north with Arnold never to return. The psychological impact on American society was profound, creating the first major test of civilian commitment to a cause that had suddenly revealed its potential for tragic failure. In the end, the Battle of Quebec stands as a monument to both American ambition and the harsh realities of 18th century warfare. Montgomery's death in the snow, Arnold's bitter retreat, and the suffering of 400 prisoners in British hands all testified to the enormous human price of revolution. The Patriots had dreamed of conquering a continent, but learned instead that independence would require sacrifices they had barely begun to comprehend. The frozen ground outside Quebec's walls held more than American blood. It contained the remains of the optimistic assumption that the revolution would be swift, decisive, and relatively painless. That illusion died with Montgomery in the pre-dawn darkness of January 1st, 1776, leaving behind a harder, more realistic understanding of the struggle that lay ahead.